So at this point, we're going to move on to showing all of the users with an index page, but as usual, let's make a commit first. So we've done the, this is a security model with access control. Let's say git add dot -m. It's the access control. Well, what do we actually do here? Oops, we've added everything now. Git diff. Let's do git log. See what our last commit was. Let's diff with that thing. Git diff. Can diff with that commit. Okay, so this is just the correct user test and friendly forwarding. So git commit -am friendly forwarding and correct user requirement. At this point, we're going to add another action to the user's controller, and this is the second to last action. So far, we've got show, new, create, edit, update. All we have left is index, which we'll put at the top, as is conventional, and then at the bottom we'll put destroy. So this section is index, and then the next section is destroy. Let's take a look at a mock-up of what we might want the user's index to look like. So here's a mock-up. As usual, we've got the site layout with the logo and the navigation links. And then the core of it is inside here, where we've got all users, and then we've got a list of users with their Gravatar images and links to their profile pages. And then we've also got pagination links, like previous, next, and then maybe links for each individual page. So whether or not the pagination will look exactly like this isn't that important. Remember, with a mock-up, it doesn't matter to get all the details right. We just want to get a sense of overall what is it going to look like. So let's write some tests for this index page. Let's put it at the top. Describe get. Remember, we get the index page. Actually, let's just review that briefly. So this is where we're going. We've got show, new, create, edit, update. So we're just filling in the top and the bottom of these. And so we're going to get the /users URL, and the action that will respond to that is index. So let's take a look at this. Get index. And now we're going to make a choice here that it's somewhat arbitrary, but we're going to decide that even though non-logged in users can look at individual profiles, we're going to restrict the index page to signed in users. You can make an opposite choice, but this is a good way to get some more practice with our security model. So let's say describe for non-signed in users. And we're going to say that it should redirect. It should... Well, remember we've been using the idea it should deny access, so it should deny access. If we look elsewhere, just to follow the same language, it should deny access. Yeah, so before we put the edit and update tests inside an authentication describe block for themselves, part of the reason for that is because they had the same access control, and part of it was because we split it into these two pieces for non-signed-in users and for signed-in users. So in this case, we're going to do the access control inside the get index test. It doesn't matter too much how you structure these things, as long as there's some logic to it. So, yeah, I did it again. Get index, and what should the response be? The response should redirect to the sign-in path. So let's save that and see if we're read as required. Good. And it's easy to get this test to pass. Just go to the user's controller and add index to the before filter, the authenticate before filter. So index, edit, update. Oh, why aren't we passing? Oh, you know what? I think it's because we have got a problem with getting an index in general. Let's take a look at this. Yeah, so there's no action index. So let's take a look at this. There we go. And what happens if the user is signed in? Let's go down, do another describe block. Describe for signed in users. And as usual, when we have this situation where a user has to be signed in, we'll use it before each block. And let's say @user equals test sign in. Now before we've actually, let me show you what we've got here. Before, when we've done test sign in, we've done @user equals factory user and then test sign in @user. That signs in as a side effect. But if you look at the sign in function in the spec helper, it actually returns the user. Remember, Ruby returns the value, the right hand value, the right hand side of an assignment. So this method not only does the setting of the current user, it also returns the user. So we can collapse. Where is it? We can collapse these two lines into a single line by doing @user equals test sign in factory of user. And now we can say it should be successful. Get index response should be successful, or be success. So we're red because it's not actually a success right now. And the reason for that, let's go take a look at it. You can see that it's missing the template. So we get to right here, missing template, users index. And so we need to add an index template to this. Let's do that. All right, so now it exists. And that's all we need to get this to pass. I see it's green. And now let's say it should have the right title. And let's have the title be all users. So get index response dot should have selector title content is all users. That'll fail, and then we say @title equals all users. Good. And now we want to have some way of describing this idea that a whole bunch of different users should all be listed on the index. So let's make a couple more users. And the way we're going to do this is by using using factory girl to create a couple more users. So let's make a second user. Actually, we don't even need to assign it to anything. Let's just do factory. This will, as a side effect, put a user into the database. Let's try this though, factory of user. It fails. Let's see why. See if you can guess why. So you see here, validation failed, email has already been taken. So what happened here is that if you look in factory girl, in the factories.rb file, there's a hard-coded email address here just to get you started with a user factory. And that's the email that's being used here as well. So we've seen once before where we had to put in an email address. Where was that? Oops. Yeah, so we did this in authentication of edit update actions. So for the reason that we gave this email address for the wrong user was because it was not just because this has to be the wrong user, but because it does have to be a different user. It raises an error otherwise. So here we go. Let's do let's just say another @example.com, and let's make another factory, another @example.net. And now let's make another test that says it should have an element for each user. The idea here is that if we get index, it should have something for each user. And we're going to make a requirement here that it be an LI. We're going to use an unordered list, a UL tag. And inside of the UL, we'll have LIs, one for each user. So let's say user.all. Remember, this is how you retrieve all the users from the database. User.all.each do, and we can say user. This block takes one variable as we iterate through the user.all array. And for each of these users, the response should have selector, and let's just say it should have an li. And the content should be the user's name. So that's not the entire content, but remember that the have selector matches the substring. So we're just saying that, based on our mockup, there should be a link actually to the user's name. But in this case, we're going to use LIs. Doesn't really matter. All right, so we're red, which is to be expected. So let's go to our index.html.drb file. We don't need these guys. So let's put in an h1 for a top-level header, which is all users. And now let's make a UL with class users. It's a good idea just to give things classes preemptively, even if we never use them. And then we're going to iterate through the users. Now remember, if we don't want to actually insert it into the template, we don't have the % equals, it's just %. And now we've got at users dot each do user, and let's make an li. And let's see, what do we want? Remember, we're going to have a gravatar for the user. And let's make it a little smaller. If you remember where was this? This is in the users helper. Yeah. Remember, gravatar takes an options hash, and there's a default size of 50 by 50, but we can give it an option. So let's make it a little smaller. Let's make it 30 by 30. And then let's put in a link to the user.name and user. And in the user's controller, we have to make an @users variable. And let's save this. Let's just go over to Autotest here and see what happens. Great, 30 examples, 0 failures. So let's see how this works. Let's go to /users, so /users. And there we go. We've got all users, but there are only 2 at this point. We've got Rails tutorial and foobar. And you might notice that we've got this little bullet point that comes by default with the li. So let's fix that. We're actually going to make a couple of custom rules. Custom.css, just go down to the bottom and say ul dot, remember the class, we give it a class users. Let's go class users, ul.users. Let's give it a margin top of 1em. And the main thing we need to do is ul.users li, and let's make the list style none. See if that worked. There we go. That looks better. And there's one more thing we want to do. Let's take a look at our links here. Home, profile, settings, help. Remember in the mock-up, we had a users link, so that's a good idea to have a link to all the users so we don't have to type it in by hand. So let's make a test in the layout link spec. It should have a settings link, and it should also have a users link. And this is going to be the same thing, except instead of the href being edit user path of @user, it's going to be users path, and the content will be users. Let's save that. It should be red at this point. Good. Let's go to the header, and let's put this here, profile users, and instead of current user, it's going to be users path. And now let's see how we're doing. Good, we're green. And now if we look back here, let's reload this page. And there we go. Now we've got a /users, a users link to /users. Cool. So we only have a couple users here, though. If you want to list all the users, it's kind of depressing only to have 1 or 2 users from just the sample users you've made by going to the sign up page. So our next task is to make some sample users for our application that will make these guys less lonely. And you might recall that from this preview this mock-up, we want to have pagination links, and yet, I mean, it's just such a pain in the neck to have to add all of these users by hand, enough users to make it actually paginate them. But it's even worse than that, because if we did make them all by hand, and then somehow our development database got clobbered, then we would have to redo it. So it's a horribly time-consuming thing. And there are some really nice gems available to make the generation of sample users really easy. So that's what we're going to do next. Let's make a commit. Get a working index page. And now we're ready to make our sample users. So the first thing we're going to do is add a really useful gem called Faker to our gem file. We only need this in development, so let's go gem Faker, and let's do version 0.3.1. Bundle install. Now, so far in this tutorial, we've seen several examples of rake tasks. We've seen rake db migrate, we've seen rake db test prepare, and in this section, we're going to add a rake task of our own. So the custom rake tasks live in the directory lib tasks. You can see that it's empty currently, so let's add one. And the rake tasks end with .rake, so let's call this sample data .rake. And now this is just a little bit of rake specific syntax. It's pure Ruby, but this is different from the other things we've seen so far in this tutorial. So the first part, though, should be at least passingly familiar. We've done some require so far. We're going to require the Faker gem that we just installed. And then we're going to make what are called namespaces. We're actually just going to use one namespace. And we'll use the same namespace that the other database-specific rake tasks use, namely the DB namespace. And it's just given by a symbol. Namespace DB do, and you can see this is a block. This will arrange for the task that populates the database to be invoked using rake DB something. And so let's describe it with the DESC for description or describe. And then we define a task using rake as follows. Task populate. And in this case, we're going to give it environment as a value to this little hash argument. And what that does is arrange to load the Rails environment, which we will need in order to get this to work. And now we want to reset the database before we do the database population. And this is a little bit advanced, but this is what will work sort of cross-platform and in all cases. We could do rake : task, and then we're going to give it a string db reset. We've done db reset before, and now we're going to be using it inside the rake task. And now the way this works is you call invoke on this thing, and that just runs rake db reset under the hood. That resets the database to an empty state. And now we're going to actually create some users. So user.createBang. Remember, it's always safer to use the loud method in case anything goes wrong. And what we're going to do here is just create an initial user corresponding to our example user. This is a user whose name and email address and password we know. Email is just do example. And now we want to make a bunch of users. So I think I'm going to make 99 users just for fun. The pagination that we're going to be using by default will paginate users 30 per page. So we just want to have more than 30, but 99 is a reasonable number, so that means we'll have 100 total. And there's a cool syntax in Ruby that we've actually seen before, back in lesson 4, where you do a number, an integer or a fixed num, and then call times on it. And it just does this thing this many times. Do n. The reason that I've got the n remember, this block actually doesn't need to take a block variable. If you go to let's just take a look at this. If you do 3 dot times, you just say put ho. Oops, maybe the closing. There we go. But it can take a block variable, as we see here. And the reason that we do this will become clear in just a moment. So let's take a look at inside this block. We're going to make a name for this user that we're about to create. And this is where faker is nice. Faker name.name. So you can Google around and find the faker documentation online. It's pretty easy to find. But so this is how you find a fake name that sounds like a real name. And then email. We're just going to say remember, this is never exposed to the end user, or is never exposed like on the web interface. So we can do this, we can make this whatever we want it to be. The reason that I have this block variable n is so that we can make the email address different for each user. And I'm going to use example dash, and then just put n plus 1 in, and just interpolate n plus 1. So example 1, example 2, example 3. Actually, yes, it's probably example 2, example 3, example 4. But in any case, this is what will work. And I'm going to have them at railstutorial.org because I've actually associated some gravatars with these example users. And let's just make the password boring. Make it foobar. Let's make it password. And then we can create the user. So user.create bang. Name is name. Email is email. Password is password. Oops. And the password confirmation is also the password. Let's just do the tab. Password confirmation is also password. Okay, that's quite a lot of Ruby. It's possibly an unfamiliar syntax in some places, but we'll see in a moment that it works really nicely. Let's do this. Let's do rake db. Now remember what we called it. We call it populate. And it's in the db namespace. So the way this works is rake db populate. And let's take a look at the results. Let's reload the users page. We need to sign in. Because we just completely flushed the database. That means that the remember token was different. And so here we go. Look at that. All users, example user, and then Mr. Cordy Roble, Florida Dietrich, Jace Cartwright Jr., Axel O'Key. So if we go to here, you can see that these are reasonable sounding names. Let's go back to users, Jace Cartwright Jr., and so on. Now, if we look at this /users page, you'll note that there are a lot of users here. It's too many, so let's paginate these guys. So the way to do this is with the will paginate gem. Let's go into the gem file and add this here. And we'll use version 3.0.pre works. I think pre 2 is out as of this writing, but it doesn't really matter for our purposes. Go ahead and, as with most of these gems, you can try to see if the latest version works just by leaving off this version number. And I'll also keep the online version of the book up to date, so you can check that out. So let's do that. Gem will paginate. Bundle install. And there we go. And now this is going to blow your mind if you haven't seen this kind of thing before. Will paginate comes with a method called will paginate. Big surprise. And I'm just going to interpolate it here, or just put it into the template using embedded Ruby. And just make another one down here. And here we go. Oh, this won't quite work actually. Yeah. Okay, so what happened here is it says undefined local variable or method will paginate for, and then a class. So you may wonder why this is doing anything at all. Like, what is this will paginate? Well, it turns out that when will paginate is inside a particular controller, in this case the user's controller, it automatically looks for an instance variable with that name. So in the user's controller, it looks for @users. That's one of the main reasons, by the way, that in the user's controller we did @users equals user.all, because we could have just said user.all.each do user the way we did in the test. Remember, in the test we did user.all.each. But we don't want to do that in this case because we'll paginate will automatically look for an @users variable. The problem here is that @users is currently user.all, and that's just an array. So let's take a look at how this works. User.all.class. Let's see what class this is. This is an array class, but will paginate expects a particular kind of object that knows how to make pagination links and has this notion that it's broken into different pieces. And the way we do that is with the paginate method. Now, this is a little bit of Ruby magic. What will paginate does is it reaches into active record and actually adds the paginate method to the user class. And paginate takes a page variable. You have to give it a hash that has a page. In this case, we'll look at page 1. And let's look at the class of this thing. So that did not work. Let's see if, and that's because we need to reload. See if reload bang is enough. Sometimes reload bang is enough. Sometimes you have to quit the console now. So that didn't work. Let's just copy this. And let's open up the console again. You may get this deprecation warning. This comes from the will paginate gem. Don't worry about it. I'm sure that it will be this will be fixed by the time it matters. So now let's just paste this in, user.paginate page1.class, and this is of class will paginate collection. It's not important to know exactly what this means, but this is a class defined by will paginate, and so if inside here we say user.paginate, let's give it a page. Actually, let's just hard code page equals 1 right now. So we probably have to restart the server too. Take a look at this. These are the kind of tricks that are hard to express in the book, but in the screencast you get all these little tricks. The things that go wrong, well, it's not that hard. You just restart the server. There we go. So that worked. All right, so you see what this did. Now it's got previous, which is not a link because this is the first page, and then next, which is the next page. See if you can guess what will happen if I click on next, though. Nothing happened. Why did nothing happen? Nothing happened because I hard-coded the page. But you might be able to guess from page 2 how to get this to work in general. You can see that there's a parameter being passed, page equals 2. So if we scroll down here, we see, remember this is the params hash. This says that page 2 is one of the in params. So let's take a look at the code. This is going to be page params of page. So now let's reload this. It should be the second page. Notice we're red, so that's a good sign that we're going to have to do something. So now we can go back and forth to the different pages. And you saw it here, because we have 100, and it's 30 at a time, that we've got 10 on this final page. And you can also click on the number. And by the way, you might wonder, why is it when you go to /users and there's no page that this works anyway? And the answer is because when this is undefined, when params of page isn't there, then this is just nil, and nil is 1 by default. So if you pass, in fact, we can see at the console. We can say, see if this is equal to user.paginate. Just test this for equality. You can see that these two things are equal. That's true. All right, now let's take a look at this red test that we got. Take a look at what's going on. Undefined method paginate for this class. So this is probably just a Spork issue. Let's quit Spork. This is the kind of thing, remember, we actually had to quit the console and we had to restart the server. So that's a pretty good sign if you're using Spork that you're going to have to restart Spork too. We'll get the same deprecation that we're ignoring. Let's look at auto test. Yeah, so when you get this line, no DRV server is running, that means that you didn't wait long enough to wait for, Spork wasn't running when I ran auto test. So let's do this. There we go. Okay, so now we're green. So that redness was actually just a result of not having restarted Spork. You will notice, though, that we aren't testing this pagination at all. And part of the reason for this is because in order to test pagination, you have to know quite a lot about how will paginate works. So it was easier to implement it first. So let's go to our test. Let's close these guys down. And in the test, what we need to do is make a bunch of users. In particular, we need to make enough users to invoke pagination. In this case, 28 would be enough. You need 30 to invoke pagination. There are 3 here, but I find it's clearer just to do 30. This is definitely enough users. So 30.times do, and now we want to make a factory user, just like we did with these two guys here. Let's make a factory user. And now we could put do n in here and create the email addresses by hand, but Factory Girl actually has a really nice abstraction for this. It's a way of saying that we want the next email in some sequence. So let me show you how to do that. So let's open factory, or factories. Remember, this is in spec factories. And the way to do this is to create what's called a sequence. Factory.sequence. And then in this case, we're going to be defining a sequence for email addresses. So let's pass it a symbol indicating the attribute do n. And let's just say this is, it doesn't really matter what we do in here as long as it's different. Person n at example.com. And then in the user controller spec, we're just going to say email is factory.email, factory.next email. And now instead of doing user.all.each, let's do user.paginate with the first page. Save that. Actually, we can just save this. This might be red because of, yeah. It was red because I hadn't saved the factories, but this should, oh, that's interesting. Let's take a look at this. This should be passing. Oh, no such, oh, it's probably a Spork thing. So while that's reloading, let's think about what we want to do here. Let's see, it should paginate users. And now we need to figure out how we're going to test for this. But that will involve looking at the actual source of the HTML code. So let's start up this guy. Okay, it's starting, and we'll run auto test. Should be green. Good. And now let's take a look at this page source. There's a div here. So this is put in by will paginate, that one line, this one little line in the index. This guy here, will paginate, automatically puts in this whole div. Div class equals pagination, span class equals previous page disabled, and then this symbol, this is an HTML code for this guy, for this arrow symbol. And then there's some other stuff here. There's links. You can see there's a link to next, which has got this URL, and so on. So let's use have selector in the tests that test for some of these specific tags. So let's do this. Well, okay, it's in users controller spec, and as usual, we have to get index. And let's say we want a pagination div, so response should have selector div.pagination. Remember, the dot there is the class, the CSS class, which we have. Class equals pagination. And let's test for the two arrows. Well, let's test for previous and next. So previous, if you look at previous, on the first page it's disabled. Let's do that. So span dot disabled, and the content is previous. Actually, let's just do this. This is cool because this will fail. It'll tell us that we have a typo. Right, so we're red because I couldn't type. There we go. And let's also test for the number 2. So the number 2 should be a link, an A, with href. Should be /users with page equals 2. And the content should be the number 2. And the final thing, let's do the last. I mean, what you actually choose to test is a little arbitrary here, but this is sort of the complete idea that there's a pagination div, there's a previous span, there's a link with a number, and then there's also a next link. And this href is /users question page. It's also the same one, page equals 2. And this content should be the word next. Let's save that. We should still be green. Remember, we're testing after the application code was already working. And now let's go into index.html.erb. Let's just comment these two guys out. Now it should be red. You don't have to do this, but I really like to. I'm paranoid. Experience has made me paranoid. So now let's undo these guys. And space backspace, and now we should be green. Cool. Let's do Control-C, run the whole test suite again. And everything is working. And we've got an index with sample data and pagination, and all the links work too. So this is a pretty decent start for our index page. Now, functionally, this is complete, but there's one refactoring that I just can't resist. It's so awesome. This is kind of sort of optional, but this is really idiomatic Rails. This is the kind of thing you will see in other people's code all the time. This is already pretty compact code. We've got our UL here at users.each2user, and then the li for each user. But we can make this simpler by factoring this li into a partial. And now I'm going to give it a name that is important. But what is this? This is just a user. So _user.html.erb is a partial for a user. And I'd like to move it over. Now if we go back to the index, we can do this. We can render the partial. Now let's just get this working. Remember, we have tests for this. So let's do render user. So this is what we've done before when we've rendered things. So let's make sure that everything's passing. Oh, everything isn't passing, so this is why you have tests. The problem here is that we don't have the user in here. So we need to pass a variable. Remember how we passed the local variable in the case of the new form. Remember, we did f is f. So this is user is user. Save this. So now we should be green. Good. But the reason I forgot that, the reason I forgot this variable bit is because you actually don't need to render it like this. You can actually just render the user object, and Rails automatically will pass it to the partial, and it knows which partial to go to. It knows to go to the user partial _user. So let's save this. Should still be green. So that's pretty cool. But what's really awesome is that you don't need any of this. We can do %= render at users. And we can get rid of all of this code. And what Rails does in this case is automatically render each user in this collection. Remember, this isn't an array. This is a will paginate collection object. But that's okay, because it's as long as it's enumerable, as long as you can call each on it, Rails will automatically call each on this thing, go through each one, and it knows it's a user object. That's how it knows to go to _user, is because if you call a class on each of these elements, it's a user class. So let's save this. Let's see, are we still green? Yes, we're still green. Let's take a look at this. Just rerun the whole test suite. And there we go. So this is really amazingly compact code. Just render at users and boom, you're done. In fact, it doesn't have to be called at users, just to make sure we're clear on this. It can be called at foo_bars. What's important isn't that it's called at users. What's important is that it is of a class user. So at foo_bars. Let's double check this. Oh, well, something's failing. Let's take a look at this. Oh, okay. So the render will work. So we can actually take a look at this. Let's comment these guys out and comment out our will paginate here. Okay, so will paginate needs it to be called at users, but the rendering does not. So render at foo_bars works fine, but the will paginate does not. So will paginate really does need it to be called at users. Although, check this out. We'll see this later on in the tutorial. If you want to tell will paginate which thing to paginate, this will work fine. Let's take a look at this. Good. So it is conventional, of course, to use an instance variable with this name, just the name of the controller in this case, the plural of the resource, just users, at users. But you don't have to. All right. Now at this point, we're ready to move on to the 7th and final action for the user's resource, namely the destroy action. So let's make a commit before moving on. Actually, let's see where we are. Git status. Okay, git add dot, git commit. And what do we do here? This was the index page with pagination, user's index.